Hi. Thank you all for being here on this beautiful day. I think the sunshine outside is going to be matched with plenty of sunshine on the inside. Wanted to remind you there are flyers which announce the Yom HaShoah celebration. We've talked to you in section and in various places about the annual commemoration of the Holocaust, and we do it at Yom HaShoah. Everybody in the community is invited. There's quite an exciting program this year, but I would like Barbara to step up and give you some more detailed information. Almost forgot.
This is well designed for short people. As you know, there's a group that helps fund the lecture series called the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust, and many of us have been here at a number of the lectures. The other thing that the Alliance does is help fund and support the annual Yom HaShoah event, which this year is the Sunday that we get back from spring break at 2 in the afternoon in Santa Rosa. There are two really wonderful things, actually three, that have been added to the program this year. As a result of an event that we had in September honoring the county's Holocaust survivors, the group decided to have the focus this year on people surviving after the Holocaust, and one of their invited speakers is somebody with whom you're already familiar, Hildy Katz. So she is going to be speaking about how she transformed her life after escaping on the Kindertransport. The other part of the program is a brand new video by Evie Eisen with original music. It should be wonderful. We have just started to preview it. And the third is a brand new component where we're involving junior high school and high school students. It's about an hour and a half. It is a program. It is a chance to be with many, many survivors, not just the few that we had in the lecture series. And I hope you would join me there. And if you've got any questions about the event, or any of you need to get a ride there, please come and see me after the lecture.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, just a little bit of business. We'll be handing out the prompt for the midterm in section this week, and we'll be going over it. So you probably want to be there to get the information that we have for you. It is my great pleasure to introduce Daniel to you. Many of you in his section already know a bit about Daniel, but I would like to, as we say, introduce him. He said you can use as much of that or as little. I'll use as much rather than little. Daniel Y. Harris has a master's in divinity from the University of Chicago. He's adjunct faculty in the lecture series this year. His dissertation specialized in Jewish theology and comparative religion, and he wrote his dissertation on the Zohar. If you want, after he's finished, you can say, Daniel, what is the Zohar? He's the co-founder of the Sparks Project. His poetry chapbook, Unio Mystica, will be by the Cross-Cultural Communications. He's a widely published poet, essayist, and visual artist. He has held executive administration positions in the nonprofit sector for 6 years, as well as academic positions at UC Berkeley and Lehrhaus Judaica. And he can be reached through his website, it's fun to say that, DanielYHarris.com. It is a great pleasure to teach with Daniel and to have him as my colleague in the series this year, and I invite you all to welcome Daniel to talk about his grandparents. Okay, it's all yours. Okay.
High enough, you can hear me? Good. Thank you, Myrna. It is an honor for me also to be teaching with Myrna in this remarkable Holocaust lecture program. I want to thank everyone for being here today. I have a lot to cover, so what I'm going to try to do is divide it into three sections. The first section, I'm going to be reading to you what I'm calling here World War II France and the Jews. And then the second part is the resistance and overview. And then I will talk briefly about what the Maquis actually are, and then I will talk about my grandfather Yves Aupert and Paulette Aupert and their faction of the Maquis in France known as the Montcalm Maquis. So, Courtney, if you would turn on that one slide. Yes, we'll go back to this. That's my grandmother, but if you could go to the de Gaulle slide. Yes, that's it. Good. We'll start here. Okay, and I will take out my glasses. I want to read you a quote before I actually begin from my grandmother. I will actually end with an excerpt from notes that she dictated to me before she passed away. But here's a quote. Everybody was chasing the Germans. My cousin Raymond and I did it too. We went to the nearest good-sized town near Izot, and we started to shoot and we started to hit. I don't know what we shot and what we hit, but we did our fair share of it. A day or two later, we were liberated. I always get this vision of my grandmother at 35 years old with guns in the air. What is she shooting at? Anyway, I asked her many times and she never gave me a complete answer. Okay, World War II, France and the Jews. So we have behind us here Charles de Gaulle giving his famous 1940 address, the appeal from London on the BBC. In 1939, there were 330,000 Jews in metropolitan France. 90,000 Jews were French-born Alsatians, Lorrainers, and descendants of Jews originally from the Iberian Peninsula. The rest had come via modern waves of immigration. In January 1940, the French army counted 60,000 Jews in its ranks, 16,000 foreign Jews enlisted hoping to acquire French citizenship. Tens of thousands of French left Paris. Approximately 15,000 Jews fled Alsace and Lorraine, followed by 40,000 refugees from Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. The mass exodus was directed towards southern France. If anyone wants those numbers again, I can make those available to you. France was invaded by the German army between May and June of 1940. Jewish soldiers and officers were taken captive by the Germans. Between 10,000 and 15,000 passed through the war in prison camps, suffering from hunger and sickness. The French government dissolved in Paris on June 11, 1940. The chief rabbi of Paris and the leaders of the Fédération des Sociétés Juives de France, which is the Federation of the Society of French Jews, retreated to Lyon. On June 18th, Charles de Gaulle gave his famous speech, The Appeal from London. An armistice was signed on June 22nd, 1940, by the government of the Marshal Henri Pétain. I don't have a picture of Pétain up here, but I wish I had thought of adding that. France was divided into a zone occupied by the Germans to the north of the Loire and an unoccupied zone to the south of the Loire, centered in Vichy. So full power was conferred upon Pétain, and they authorized to draft a new constitution. Just a little footnote here to my notes, and that is that Pétain, for many of you know, was a World War I hero. So he gave a sense of stability and a sense of a calm and prosperity, when in fact the reverse will turn out to be true. But the French, for the most part, in 1940, felt compelled to admire this great World War I hero who was already quite an old man by the time that he was given the official title whatever it is that they wanted to call him, chancellor, president, Monsignor, whatever you want. So after this constitution, French Jews were considered no longer citoyens de la République, in other words, citizens of the Republic, but rather social, political, and religious pariahs. Punishing defamation or injury in the press was repealed. Anti-Semitic newspapers such as, I'll read them in French first and I'll tell you what they mean, Les Nouveaux Temps, Le Cri du Peuple, and Je suis partout. Le Nouveau Temps is the New Time. Le Cri du Peuple is the cry or the scream of the people, and Je suis partout, I am everywhere. Very ominous names of these papers. Stirred French hatred of the Jews, a combination of, Jews in Vichy were, well, pardon me, I think I lost myself. Where am I? Pardon me, this happens. Oh yes, okay. Jewish artists, writers, and professors and journalists were denied employment. Franco-German collaborationist groups operated without any restrictions. Jews were required to register with the sous-préfet, which is basically the mayor of all towns in the south part of France, which is Vichy. In the northern part of France, Jews were actually not permitted to live in the northern part of France. So these particular restrictions began to be imposed upon the Jews in the southern part of France, which supposedly was free France or unoccupied. Okay, so immediately abiding by the laws of the 1942 Wannsee Conference, which all of you who have taken this course know by now, you know the date of it, you know what took place, Vichy implemented its own policy of Aryanization. Jewish property was plundered, Jewish businesses and goods were transferred to Aryan and non-Jewish officials, Jews were forced to wear the yellow star, Jewish refusal to comply led to arrest and deportation. Pétain, Pierre Laval, and their milice, the French Gestapo, actively participated in the implementation of a France sans Juifs, without Jews. Now, many of you should be asking yourself a question, and that is, why is this happening in the southern part of France, which supposedly had reached a kind of a neutrality, was unoccupied. They called it Free France. Well, in fact, what was going on was the reverse, and they implemented a kind of a constitution to enable Jews to be arrested before and identified through the Star of David. Okay, I realize that I have many more notes to a book that I can possibly offer you today, because I have to talk about my grandparents. I want to talk about my grandparents. So I'm skipping a few sections. But here are some staggering numbers. For France, the country, liberté, égalité, fraternité, the country of French philosophy, the country I was born in, 42,655 Jews were deported from France to Nazi concentration and death camps in 1942. 42,000. Now, if we compare that to Poland or to other, of course, Eastern European countries, the number seems small. But if you imagine that this is happening inside of a country who established, if you will, the right and humanity, the philosophy of citizenry, influencing so much, if you will, the United States, it is staggering to imagine that the complicity enabled 655,000 Jews to actually be deported to concentration camps in 1942. In 1943, the number went down to 17,041. In 1944, 16,025. Still, that's a lot of people to transport to concentration camps or death camps. By the liberation of Paris on August 22nd, 1944, 23% of Jews in France had been deported. All right, 23% again doesn't seem compared to other countries, but again, I have to emphasize the place of France in modern civilization. 23% is very, very high. 87% of that 23% were over 17 years old. The remaining 13% were under 17. They were children. So if you look at those numbers, actually, that means that many children were saved. So that's actually one of the promising elements in this discussion, is that many Jewish children were saved. Okay. By comparison to the Jews of Europe, and I just said this, the Jews of France were relatively less subject to deportation. The anti-Catholic and anti-French measures of the German occupation had aroused anti-German and anti-Vichy action among a small percentage of the French citizenry. Despite the Vatican's failure to respond, both Catholic and Protestant dignitaries openly denounced the persecution, which were followed by rescue missions and assistance. The underground presses attacked the roundups. Jews survived anonymously in a vast underground network of black market products, false identity papers, hiding places, presses, and performed acts of sabotage. This was the resistance. Okay, good. All right. The French resistance and overview. The Jews of France, French and foreign, participated in various resistance movements from 1940 until the end of the war. Operating in France and in London, displaying various ideological tendencies, armed, maquis, and unarmed, they operated in underground overlapping networks. Responding to General Charles de Gaulle's June 18, 1940 appeal, many Jews went to London to enlist in the Free French forces, prompting de Gaulle's famous remark that at the beginning his entourage consisted only of fishermen from Ile-de-Seine and Israelites. Israelites. I think they belong back in the ancient world. But anyway, interesting. Interesting to use the word Israelite. Men and women in the resistance were of a variety of nationalities, religiosities, and political tendencies. French, Belgian, Polish, German, Russian, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Communist, Zionist, you name it. In the French resistance, you had kind of background who were participating in the resistance. But remember, the numbers are still very low. Communist resistance groups such as Main d'Oeuvre Émigrée accepted Jews. Some resistance groups accepted neither communists nor Jews. Some groups such as Stekol were entirely Jewish. Some, such as Popa, were mixed. Paramilitary organizations such as the Valmy belonged to Franc-Tireurs, and the partisans recruited Jews and persons of any political persuasion. In other words, that little soundbite note is that there was a great difference among the resistance groups, and that many of the resistance groups had nothing to do with Jewish people, less about Jews. They were worried about anti-Catholic measures. They were worried about anti-French, about the Germanization, if you will, of France. So they were those groups. Some of them were entirely Jewish. Some were mixed. Some were communists. Some were anti-communist. There were hundreds and hundreds of different groups. Okay. In November 1940, the Vichy government ordered all prefects to dismiss left-wing elected towns and villages. When Jean Moulin, okay, can we move to do we have a picture of Jean Moulin? Yes, there he is, the famous Jean Moulin. Okay, good. All right, so when Jean Moulin refused, he was himself removed from office and joined the resistance. Moulin reached London in September 1941 under the name Joseph Jean Mercier and met with Charles de Gaulle, who asked him to unify the various resistance groups in France. Can you imagine what that challenge for Jean Moulin? He really was not equipped in many ways to do this, but he believed in it. He had been, if you will, in politics, but his job was to take factions of disparate resistance groups and try to create an amalgam under one voice, which is difficult because I have also that some of the resistance groups were deeply anti-Semitic. So how do you reconcile anti-Semitic resistance groups with resistance groups that are entirely Jewish? Difficult problem. All right. So, Moulin reached, okay, so then on January 1st, 1942, he parachuted back into France. Under the code names of Rex or Max, he met with leaders of the resistance groups. And there were really 6 major groups, okay? But underneath these 6 major groups, there were hundreds of Maquis units, special forces, so forth. The major groups are Combat, Libération, Franc-Tireur, Front National, Comité d'Action Socialiste, and the Armée Secrète. Okay? Again, if you want more information, let me know and I can give you those names and you can look them up. The group under which my grandfather was associated was the Armée Secrète. All right? So that's where you'll find the connection in part 3 of this talk. Okay. March 21st, 1941, Moulin formed the Conseil National de la Résistance, the CNR, the National Council of the Resistance. I mean, it sounds kind of silly, but the CNR existed. The first meeting of the CNR took place in Paris on May 27th, 1943. Those of you who know a bit about this subject realize that to actually convene a meeting in Paris of the top officials of the French resistance is quite dangerous. But being clandestine, being clothing, manner of style, being able to somehow be anonymous was how they off. And that's how he always dressed. He had a hat. Anyway, they blended in as if you will, upper class French citizens moving about Paris, and no one detected them until Jean Moulin was arrested on June 21st, 1943. He was interrogated at a prison camp known as Montluc by Klaus Barbie. And all of you probably know about Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. Again, please come and see me if you want to learn more about him. And he died under brutal torture aboard a Paris-Berlin train, taking him to a concentration camp. Okay? By the winter of 1943, after the death of Jean Moulin, the unification of disparate resistance groups under the CNR had failed. By 1944, in spite of the failure of the CNR, hundreds of independent groups of resistance, partisans, and maquisards foiled German and Vichy efforts to arrest and deport Jews. Communists and sympathizers by bombing trains, bridges, German tanks, and military vehicles. Okay? So in other words, how you are to, if you will, look at this is that these groups functioned independently. There was no central command after the murder of Jean Moulin. There was a national plan, if you will, to reclaim France, but certainly not a central figure who was dictating, if you will, the modus operandi by which organizations were to function. They just functioned independently with that objective, and many of them were armed. Many of them might be called terrorists today, but the ones who were actually accused of these actions were themselves called terrorists, which is quite humorous. Maquis. What is maquis? What does the word maquis mean? Maquis is a word that means high ground covered with shrub growth where groups of armed resistance hid. That's the name actually comes from Corsica, but the actual implementation of the word begins this way. Later, the word would come to mean those disparate groups of armed resistance, generally speaking. So there were hundreds of different Maquis units. Some Maquis units were named after people. Some were named after towns. Some were named after newspapers. Some were named in code. I'll give you an example. There was the Maquis de Laon, the Maquis de Glières, the Maquis de Vercourt. My grandfather's unit was called the Montcalm Maquis. And I don't want to embarrass John over here, but he provided me with a book where I saw for the first time in my life, my wife and I were both just completely mortified. We actually have a picture, which we'll show a little bit further on in the slide, of the Montcalm Maquis units, part of them dead in a small room. It was absolutely unbelievable. I have many pictures, but never of the unit. There were always pictures of just my grandfather, and this is the first. I mean, of course, we don't know who took that picture, but someone caught a picture of the Montcalm Maquis. It's absolutely, Montcalm was the name that my grandfather used. That was his code name. So it's just a remarkable phenomenon. Okay, let's begin with, let's backtrack with some of the, that's basically the overview of the French resistance and World War II. Again, this is a rather brief and truncated effort to supply you with a wealth of information with a limited amount of time. But let's go to this story here of my grandparents, which is really the main focus of this, because the first part is the abstract. The second part is the core ingredients of the abstract, and the third part is the honor that I feel for actually being connected to people who were involved in this. It makes me, every day that I think about this, it is a great honor for me to talk about this and to also share it with you. That is my grandmother, and she's holding one of the children. The date is 1947. She spent after the war gathering children. Actually, she was part of something called the Aliyah Project, which was basically to take children who were stranded in Europe and give them homes in Israel. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, so there she is with one of the survivors, again in 1947. Let's go to one more. Okay, so here's the one of the few pictures I actually have of my grandmother. There she is right there, and my grandfather, Yves Aubert, right here, and Paulette Aubert. The year was 1935. Life was good. They were pretty well-to-do. The French life seemed fine. Bourgeois, in other words, meant that they were a part of the upper classes, as much as Jews could be part of the upper classes. They lived well, and things were fine. Okay, now I have snippets here, and I'm going to improvise off my snippets the way a jazz musician might improvise off a series of scales. Okay, Yves was conscripted into the French army in 1939, and he was attached to the Maginot Line. Now, you might know that the Maginot Line was this harebrained, forgive me, anyone who is French, I'm French, but it was a harebrained scheme reminiscent of the First World War, where, as you know, the Germans and the French just kind of stood side by side or across each other and just killed each other continually for 4 years. They thought the same war was possibly pending on the French border. So they set up this Maginot Line, which was basically from the border, it bordered Germany from southern Belgium to northern Switzerland, covering about 200 kilometers. And this is where France put much of its army and of its soldiers and its officers. They placed them there. For those of you who have done your reading, a little bit of your scholarship on this, you'll of course remember that the Germans went up and down the Ardennes forest into Paris, and they took France. Yves was arrested by the German army, and he was sent to a POW camp. Okay? Nothing about him said, "I am Jewish," which I don't know. I always wonder about the idea of physiognomy or phrenology. Can you tell a person's ethnic identity by their face? I ask myself, do I look Jewish? Does he look Jewish? I don't. He was never identified as a Jew, which is an amazing phenomenon. I'll get to that part. So Paulette, my grandmother, received retrenchment orders as a Red Cross nurse, for that's what she was trained in, and she went to Périgueux in the southwestern part of France during the exodus out of Paris. And if you recall what that exodus out of Paris, as I mentioned, what it was like for everyone, it wasn't just Jews escaping from Paris after the new constitution and the armistice was put into place. It was anyone who had any potential fears that maybe they would be arrested, deported, or what have you. So a mass exodus of people were leaving the north and going south. My grandmother was actually part of that group of people who were trying kind. And of course, there was difficult to get gasoline. You had to be extremely wealthy if you owned a car, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these problems. Anyway, she ended up there, and she stayed. Now, during this time, my grandfather escaped 3 times from this POW camp and was caught 3 times and brought back in. The 4th time, he actually made it. And the amazing part is, he was in Germany. This prison camp, POW camp, not a concentration camp, a prisoner of war camp, was in Germany. He crossed over the border into France. He went into a peasant village. He went and he spoke to a couple of the peasant farmers, and he got a change of clothing. And he got a hat and a change of clothing, and he made his way to Paris, basically unaware that Paris was no place for a Jew to be. So somehow he found a way to take a train, and he headed to the south. It took him about 2 or 3 months to find my grandmother. No one knows how these things happen. I mean, the underworld or the underground network of resistance people was very intricate. They used to have coding systems. They would maybe keep a message inside of a filter, a long filter of a cigarette holder. Somehow he found out where she was, and they met up. Astonishing. I still remember my grandmother actually telling me this story. Let's go on to the next one. Let's see what we have. Yeah, good. Okay, that's the famous picture in our home. 35 years old. That is as old as he ever was. And for us, he's always been this face with this beret. This hero of our family and of France. Okay, so then so Paulette, Eve, and their 2 daughters, one being my mother, moved to Saint-Étienne. Eve assumed the role of a quartermaster, and he began to distribute food to thousands of starving people. Again, this was kind of subversive activities. But they found an old warehouse. They went through a lot of these old buildings, and they found food, and they began to distribute food. They even put articles in the newspapers, but not as Jews, not as French members of the resistance, not as Maquis, but as ordinary French citizens who were trying to feed people because, of course, as you all probably know, the Germans were taking everything they possibly could out of France. The food, the wine, the grain, the fruit, you name it. Everything, the meat, was all going to Germany to feed an ever-growing, massive German offensive. Eve was arrested by the milice in 1942. Now remember that year, 1942. This is the year where France surreptitiously, in other words, in a kind of a hidden way, is implementing the new German constitution, the anti-Semitic laws, assisting in the final solution. You all know what that is. The milice are French police, but they are Gestapo because they are being trained by the SS. Some of them are French, some of them are German. They are functioning as the French Gestapo in the southern part of France, and of course in the northern part of France. So actually, they went and they arrested him while he was distributing this food, and he was sent to a camp for not a concentration camp, but a prison camp for criminals. And he was held in solitary confinement. My grandmother knew this because she had been told by members of, they were in the Haute-Savoie part of France, and there were lots of different resistance groups, so messages were passed. My grandmother found out that he had actually been arrested, and this time it was serious. One of the things that she said to me is what they would do with soldiers or with Jews or whatever they thought that he might have been, she's talking about the Germans, in these prison camps, is exactly how she put it. They would oftentimes go to these bars and they would drink, and then the result of whatever kind of social activities they would do, someone was held responsible for killing 12 people the next day. So she was convinced that my grandfather was going to be one of those 12 people. Don't ask me. I mean, this is a very different world that we're talking about here, okay? So the objective, the person who lost whatever game they were playing, would be responsible for killing 12 inmates in a prison camp, whether they were Jews. All these they were all accused of subversive activities, of espionage, of being communist, of being anti-French, anti-German. It didn't matter what the verdict of the arrest was, what the content of the arrest was. So, this is the wonderful part of the story. Oh, quick. All right. My grandmother, let's see the next one. What's the next one? Okay, just stop here. This is an example of a maquis unit. Okay, we'll leave that there. My grandmother was a very, very attractive woman. Now, I'm not trying to be anti-feminist here, but I want you to know that she dressed up. This will be reminiscent to all of you to the story of Lucie Aubrac, which I found when I first came across it. I found, again, haunting similarity between these two ladies, although in this case, the husband does not survive. My grandmother wore the most elegant Parisian clothes that she could possibly wear, and she found out from the underground that there was a member of Pétain's official staff who was actually in Saint-Étienne, and that he was playing what my grandmother called a double game. But they were never sure that it was actually a double game. It could be complicity on top of complicity, on top of being an alias, etc. Anyway, she took the step, and the name that she never knew, she always called him Simon. I don't know why, but for some reason, this particular Vichy Pétain official remained as Simon, all right? So, she went to Saint-Étienne, to the office of Simon, that name, and she asked him in code. Again, she doesn't remember what the code words were, and I was asking her for a long time, but whatever code we want to put in there. She asked him in code if they could have a meeting outside the office. So, he did not say anything, this remarkable Simon. He said that he would like my grandmother for lunch, because it was going to be the lunch hour, outside at a local restaurant. My grandmother left the building, and she told me she was trembling. She didn't know if this was a very, very bad situation for her. She could have easily been arrested on the spot in this French restaurant, yet she waited with her elegant self. She sat there and she waited. The man showed up and said, "Okay, so what do you want?" And they exchanged codes, and she said to him miraculously that a certain Lieutenant Colonel Yves Aupert was mistakenly arrested and sent to a prison camp, and that he should be immediately released. It's not right for France. And that night, after a call from this official to the warden of the prison camp, he was released. This is remarkable. You have to understand, this is remarkable. I mean, how did she pull this off? Why? Did the Vichy official find her attractive? Did he try to help? Was he really playing a double game? Was he working up? No one knows what the details were, but my grandfather was released. Okay, so after this happens, they go back to Saint-Étienne, which is the town where they were in, but unfortunately, when they arrived, news of the arrest had become public knowledge. So what they did is the milice, which were there, but of course they were not permitted to arrest him because he had been released through a direct order from the great Maréchal Henri Pétain. They put a pancarte, which is kind of a poster, on the outside wall of the apartment house where they lived, saying that A certain Yves opened door in the middle of a war where the Aryanization, the Germanization of France is going on a continual basis. So they leave. They leave quickly. But they had to sign over everything that they owned, the furnishings in their apartments, all of their belongings, and then they rode two bicycles with their children for 280 kilometers and settled in a village near Grenoble called Izot. So at this point, they are in this village. This village of Izot is rather well known. It has a Protestant minister, as does Le Chambon, which I'll talk about in a second. You all might remember or know that the Protestants were severely persecuted throughout the history of Catholic France, and therefore the empathy, if you will, of the Protestant Huguenots towards Jews was at a higher level, if you will, than the Catholics, although Catholics did help Jews. But if you had a Protestant minister as a minister of a small village, the odds of Jewish survival were higher than if the case was a Catholic priest. Okay, so the Gestapo came in 1943 to search for Jews in Izot, where they were. Why? Because that was the order of the and by what I mean by Gestapo, I mean milice. The French Gestapo went from town to town to town to town to town, literally, as you all know in your readings and what you've done so far, studying, that there was an effort, a conspicuous, calibrated effort to extract all Jewish people from every single town, village, or city in France, and of course in the rest of Europe. So what you're having is these very discreet kind of milice officials milling about. So my grandmother panicked, as she normally would have. Let's go to the next picture. Let's see where we are. Okay, good. We'll stop right there. Good. I'm kind of cross-pollinating this whole thing here. So she took her children. Yves was not there. He was actually involved at this point with the Maquis, which I'll get to his position in a second. She took her two children by bicycle to a small village called Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, where a very well-known minister named André Trocmé had devised clandestine hiding places and escape routes for Jewish children. Okay? They stayed there for 3 months, okay? Because this town, there's a wonderful books written about this on Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. 5,000 Jewish children were saved, either in the town through these transports. My mother and grandmother stayed there for 3 months. And she began to assist my grandfather in the transportation of messages all over Haute-Savoie, Lyon, all the places. So this is what she did for that faithful year before the death of Jean Moulin. So imagine, for a while, you have the children, my mother and aunt, being protected, if you will, by André Trocmé in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. My grandfather is happily blowing up trains. That's what they did. How many? We don't know. But they blew up trains, and I'll talk more about that. This is an example of sabotage that is in this book from Raymond Aubrac, the husband of Lucie Aubrac. So this is what he did, and she transported messages. She was the conduit, one of many, many conduits, to help arrange meeting places for members of these Maquis units, because you can imagine what it would be like. How do you arrange? It's hard to know ourselves today. Imagine trying to schedule an appointment to have 6 different members of 6 different groups of Maquis to arrange to meet in this place to take care of this train, because this train is carrying these documents and this has to be stopped. So she organized all of that. Okay? So that was wonderful. Jean Moulin is unfortunately, as I mentioned, killed in 1943. And as with many of the resistance groups, the Montcalm Maquis continued their work without a central command. Can you go to the... no, let's go further. Where's that Montcalm? Oh, we don't have it? Okay. Well, I will show anyone. There is a tragic photograph of 4 men dead in a ravine who were part of the men of my grandfather's unit. The unit began with about 20 or 25, maybe 30 of these special forces, of these Maquis, and by the end there were only 4 left, and only 2 actually survived beyond 1945. Okay, so between the winter of 1943 and the death of my grandfather in 1944, June 26th, the Montcalm Maquis devoted much of his time to derailing trains. All right, well, you remember that picture there of derailing trains? And documents. Now, I have done some research on this, and this is tenuous research, because again, whenever you're looking at these things, it's hard to actually extract originals, but you can get commentaries on originals. But what was supposedly in these documents were, oh, wait a minute, here, let me put up. Okay, lists of arrested and or killed Maquis, Jewish men who fought in World War I. Why? Why would you want to have Jewish men who fought in World War I? Killing Jews. That was the objective, remember, killing Jews. Jewish registrants who were forced to register and display the yellow star. I told you that number, that over 179,000 Jews in southern France were forced to register and eventually be forced to wear a yellow star. Names of suspected spies, terrorists, confiscated land and property deeds, food products, and military equipment from France to Germany and vice versa. So Paulette retrieved her children from Le Chambon. Meanwhile, the Jews in Izot had to the basement of an abandoned house once inhabited by the milice. So, in other words, this abandoned house, the Maquis units had found a way to actually expel the milice living in this town, and they hid in the basement. They lived for 1 year on basically what would be considered starvation rations, avoiding starvation with the occasional arrival of foods through the Maquis circuit. Paulette saw Yves in Lyon one last time on May 25th, 1944. That was Yves' birthday. American B-12 bombers were trying to bomb the tracks around Lyon. According to my grandmother, who told me 40 years later that it went on all night, but that the B-12s had missed all the tracks, and that a dozen Maquis were more effective than an arsenal of B-12 bombers bombing from 24,000 feet. Interesting. The Maquis units would go on to help the Allied forces, actually, to liberate France after the war. I want to read to you and then give you some more details, because I actually found a book. This is what people like us do, is constantly look for books. It's an insanity, I'm telling you. I found a book that actually describes, through testimony from people my age, who grandparents witnessed the murder of many people in France, in French villages. I never told my grandmother about this because she didn't want to know the actual details of how he was killed. But this is how she puts it. These are documents that I put together that my grandmother would dictate, and I would write them down and so forth. I have videos. We did a wide variety of different kinds of interactions. So I'd like to read to you actually in her words. So Forgive the grammar. Those of you who have become very sensitive to grammar in this class, forgive the grammar. This is an old lady speaking in not her native language. A hero's death. Yves had been on a very important mission with his commandos. A train had left from Lyon with many cars full of stolen documents and files, all containing information about the French underground. They had all the Gestapo files about the people, the ones they arrested and the ones they wanted to arrest. My husband got the order to stop that train and prevent it from going into Germany. He and his men were to stop it well before the border and take all the Germans in prisoner and make sure that all the files were taken out of the cars and given to his men who would take them safely back to their camp. All this was to happen in the middle of the night. Notice that they were not to kill them. That's a very important part. It was very important additionally because the Germans had kept the files from the First World War, and this was the second, and they had the files so much that when my father wanted France and Spain, wanted to escape Spain and go to Morocco, and there were 4,000 people trying to pass on the bridge between France and Spain, they couldn't. Excuse me for that. I really wanted this to be verbatim, so it's a little bit, but it's lovely because it has a kind of it has an authenticity. Verbatim, a person's testimony has an authenticity in this situation. They all had been told that you leave the cars and baggage behind and pass walking, but you leave everything you own behind. When my father got to the border, he went to the border police. He gave his name and who he was from the First World War, and they had his name on files from the French intelligence service. There you go. That's that part about looking for World War I Jews. Because of this, they let him pass with his car. Later, the Gestapo got a hold of those files and came looking for him in Paris. So we knew that he had to stop them from getting those names back to Germany because this was again all over. This was thing all over again. Getting the suspicious people from the Second World War to hope to catch them is the third one. My husband and his commandos put on plastic on the rail to stop a train. The rail blew up when the train came over and the train stopped. He had arranged with a farmer down in the valley to keep those Germans on his farm, then prisoner, and have my husband take them little by little, 10 by 10, 20 by 20 to his camp. The farmer was ready to take them on his land and lock their goods known to them in the barn. They got the Germans out, they got the files out, they got everything done. The whole command got up to the farm with the Germans and with all the papers. My husband took the first load of 25 or 30 and whatever he could take in the truck and brought them about 40 kilometers from there to his camp. Some of the boys wanted to go. He refused, saying there weren't enough of them already to take care of this whole load of Germans. You can't come with me, he said. I can take care of it myself. You have to hold them here. While he was going to this camp with the Germans, there was in that train one man from the French milice, which was the French Gestapo. They were French who had been trained by the Germans, and they were the ones who really did most of the denunciation. That guy from the French milice went up to the telephone, called the Gestapo in Annecy, which is again another village in the Haute-Savoie, which was the main city where my husband was going, told him his whereabouts, told the truck he was driving, how he was coming back to camp alone, back to the farm to pick up the Germans. They managed to come in before he returned. They caught up with him about a mile outside of the farm. They blew his tires. They blew the 4 tires. He was taken in a field next to the truck where apparently there was a fountain because today there is a plaque on that fountain. Well, one of the last slides we'll show you in a second, which is actually in Étercy. You can actually go and see this incredible plaque. They tortured him from very early in the morning, around 6 o'clock, until he finally fell dead sometime past nightfall. They wanted to know what his base was, where his camp was. They wanted to know all about him. Of course, all the secret missions they were on. He never talked. They finally killed him in the field. There, his men came and they shot the Germans using until the last bullet they had, but they couldn't stop it. His commandos saw everything and couldn't do anything about it. They had no more armaments. They were still holding all the Germans in the threat farm until the Germans who killed my husband came and released them. He was left dead there on the ground. The peasants from the village made a makeshift casket with whatever wood they could find and buried him in the cemetery with a French flag on his tomb and the inscription unknown. They didn't know who he was. Étercy, Haute-Savoie was the name of the village and also the name of his territory. Then the Germans went to the farm and killed the farmer. So that night the Germans killed my husband and killed the farmer. The next day it was unbelievable. It was a massacre. The next day, the commandos arrested the one they were shooting that shot my husband. Then they arrested him in Nancy, killed him, took him. Then they went to Étercy, went on the tomb of the husband, and killed him on the tombstone. Okay, recollections of an old lady. Very close indeed. Even more severe, actually, than that. And I don't know why. Well, I want to tell you the details because I want you to know very quickly what it must to die by the blunt of a rifle. So the way that he was tortured is he was beaten to death very slowly for about 10 hours. Slowly. And my grandmother never knew that until eventually he died. He was bludgeoned to death with the butt of a rifle. And there's a book that describes this. Rather horrible. My grandmother found out later from one of the members of the unit that he had been killed. She'd go and make sure that was true, but he was surrounded, but the village was surrounded by the French milice, and that was not possible. So, France and Paris is liberated on August 22nd. Yves is killed on June 26th. After the liberation of Paris and the liberation of villages, which, by the way, was not a direct connection. Sometimes these villages were actually burned down by what are reminiscent of Cossack pogroms. Hungarians and what have you would just be following wherever they could. Their orders were, because they were working in collaboration with the Nazis to burn all the villages. Luckily, the village where my grandmother was not burned down. It was somehow passed by, and the war ended. So, heroically, my grandmother drove to the place where he was, Étercy. She picked up the body in a casket. She, of course, never looked inside because that's not Jewish. Looking at a body is not a Jewish thing to do. So you keep a memory of the person alive and you don't contemplate their death. So she drove the body by herself while her children were still in the town being supported by the villagers of the town in Izot. And she drove the body back to Paris and was able to give him a military funeral. And his grave is still there. And that is basically in 1944. So I want to show you a couple of pictures. What my grandmother's story, which unfortunately we can't really talk about today, but I can talk a little bit about it because it's post-1945. This is what she would go on to do for the next 30 years, is she felt compelled to find out what had happened to the children because, as she said, her two children was the reason why she worked so hard to support the resistance. And the memory of her husband was going to be somehow maintained through immortality, if you will, by children. So here she is with children. Can you tell me what the next one is? Okay, so again, this is 1946, 47. These are survivor prison camps. There's my grandmother up there, and the children, and these are again, they're in France. She set up places. She was very active in setting up houses for people to live, for people to do things. She set up where workers could work, where children could grow up, and eventually, if possible, be taken to Israel. Let's see the next one, please. Okay, so here's an example. This is not my grandmother, but this is an example of a photo, one of the children's homes that my grandmother was. And the job was really to try to find families who would take all of these Jewish children. And there were many, 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 many children left behind. And this is an example of one of these children's homes, which she actually was involved with from 1940, 44, 45 until the State of Israel, 1948. And then basically she was in the United States from 1948, 1949, although she was in Israel in 1948. And she would go on to talk about these children, and she became a national celebrity, at least to people who are in this particular area. She was a very well-known spokesperson for several Jewish organizations. Let's see the next one, please. Okay, so there's another one of these homes here. The children. There's military. There she is holding children. Again, these are original pictures that I have. A funny story is when she passed away, which is not a funny story, the family fought over the pictures. Oh my goodness! And we're still fighting today. And hopefully, as this is being recorded, I can send this off to my family and let them know that I'm still talking about it. But there are many, many wonderful documents and photographs that are priceless. And the family so I got a lot of them because I was the oldest son and grandson, etc. But people are still fighting for these pictures. I have a lot of them. Okay, next one, please. Little side note. There she is, the great lady. She was known for. As a matter of fact, she told me that eventually she stopped reading from her notes. And one of the things I've been doing a lot too is trying to stay away from notes. It's more effective just to speak. But my grandmother gave us her first speech, I believe, in about 1946-47 with notes. And she looked down at the paper and she just spoke very, very quietly, looking down at the paper. And someone came up to her and said, "Listen, you're magnificent. Get rid of the paper and look up." She never used another note in her life and looked up. She would just simply speak out of this incredible memory with a French accent. The way she looked, she dazzled people, and throughout the United States, she raised millions and millions of dollars for these children to live in the United States, to live in Israel. That's what she spent most of her time doing. This is her from 1950, I believe. And she actually went from being this woman who was without a husband to having Eleanor Roosevelt, Moshe Dayan, many of the illustrious figures in our history she knew. Okay, let's go to the next one. Next one. Aha! Okay, so this is it. This is Yves Hotel and Léon Chardin. And this was basically, this is the memorial that is in Itercy. You can actually go there and see it. And you'll notice that it says, ils sont membres de la résistance et morts pour la liberté. So they were members of the resistance and they died for liberty. Nothing about being Jewish. That's the part. I'm not saying that there is continuous or continual anti-Semitism. So there is, but in these towns there's a reluctance to talk about the Jewish component. Okay, and at the documents. Okay, original documents, which I have the good fortune of having. Certificat de validation. Okay, this one is actually from 1963, but so here's basically from the French government acknowledging Yves' death. Okay, next one. Great, and you'll see over here that name there is Montcalm. Okay, and this document comes from 1948. So, by this point, Montcalm, the name and the chief operator, if you will, of the Montcalm Maquis is acknowledged in this certificate, for which he was awarded the Legion of Honor. Next one, please. All right, this is another one. This is actually from the French consulate in Damascus. I don't know why. I wish I knew why. I have asked about this many times, and I don't know why. I hope someday to actually find out why it's from the French consulate in Damascus. But there you have it, acknowledging again that this Yves Hotel, what his function was, Combat, Itercy, 1944. There, the two of them are down there again. All right, anything else? Right, so here's another document, and this one is from 1948. These are all very important documents. If you remember from the lecture of last week with Anna Rossma, she was talking about getting documents and the importance of having actual physical evidence of the people who were involved and we have countless documents of his activity. It proves it, because what happens over time, as you all are beginning to see now throughout this course, is that memory starts getting a little bit hazy. And people start losing awareness of what happens, and dates get confused, and times and so forth, and countries, and pretty soon a century goes by, unless you have documents, who knows really what took place? So we have these documents. Next one, please. Okay, my grandmother with Moshe Dayan. Those of you who might know Moshe Dayan, he was instrumental in the early Arab-Israeli wars, and so she knew him. Next one, please. Okay, right. So now this is my grandmother. So the Chokmeh wife and daughter, and Philip Halley, who was a professor, I believe, of history or maybe sociology, who wrote a book called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed, where he talked about the children who were in the Chambon. Well, one day my grandma talked, and they met and said, oh my God, they had a direct connection, obviously, they knew each other, and so what they did for a long time, now my grandmother is not old here, she's probably, I don't know, she's probably 75. She died at the age of 93. So here they went on a tour through the United States and Europe with Philip Halley and with the Chokmehs talking about Le Chambon. So that was an amazing thing. Very proud of that. Next one, please. Okay, and there's Magna Chokmeh, and there's Philip Halley, and there's my grandmother. And this was a very successful retelling of the story of Le Chambon, who had been there and who went through that. Next one, please. Okay, this is the last one, I believe. And this is not the end, this is really the end of my grandmother's active life, where she helped Ethiopian Jews go to Israel. So here she is with a young Ethiopian Jewish child who she is bringing through an airlift into the state of Israel. And basically she spent the last 10 years of her life living quietly, and she at the age of 93 and left behind a tremendous legacy. And I feel honored that I had a chance to get to that legacy, because surprisingly enough, how much she enjoyed talking, she didn't want to talk about this very much. And, why do you keep asking? Why do you want to know this? She kept on saying to me. And I pushed and I pushed and I pushed, and I kept track of the information. Okay, good. Please, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Questions, please? Feedback? Anything? Yes, please.
How old were you in relation with your grandmother when you were talking to her and you were so interested in it?
Yeah, I began after France. Yes, the question is, when did I evolve with being interested in this subject? I moved here, from France when I was 10. And I think between 1 and 10, I would say probably not. I was just a little kid. But after my bar mitzvah at the age of 13, I began to start talking to my grandmother. She began to start talking to me. She said to me, "Well, now what does it mean for you to be a Jew?" Well, you know what? I was a kid. I was 13. What does it mean to be a Jew? And she began to start talking to me about what world history was like and what she did. Started to educate me, and it went on and on and on from the age of 13 until I was 2 years ago, of 42. So that's a long period of time where I had a chance to hear her speak. I had a chance to attend one of these things where Philip Halley and the Chokmehs were there. And I had a chance to do a lot of things throughout my and of course I have several chapters of a book that, again, story of my life. To one day get this into a book. I have three chapters, and one day it'll be a book. More questions, please. Yes.
Comment, and that is that part of the genius of De Gaulle was that he decided that for the resistance units, there should never be more than 3 people, and he called them les brigades, the dryads, and like that you would avoid denunciations, detection, and knew the other people's names.
Did everyone hear that? Yeah, good. And that's the tragedy. Yes, it is the genius of De Gaulle, and that's why the tragedy of Jean Moulin didn't just happen by coincidence. He was denounced by someone working on the inside. They knew that they were going to be meeting in Paris or wherever they decided to have a meeting, and at some point he was denounced, and the guy's name was, and people still think that Hardy, even though France does not acknowledge that he is actually the murderer of Jean Moulin, the way we don't know who the murderer of John F. Kennedy was, there's still some suspicion, and Hardy is still not called the murderer of Jean Moulin. There's a great suspicion. So yes, you're absolutely right. They would only travel in small groups, and the ones who were caught from the inside. Myrna.
Daniel, what is the name of the movie about Jean Moulin?
What is the name of the movie about Jean Moulin?
Isn't there a
Yes, there
movie
is.
about? Does anybody know?
I think you were going to announce that next week. You
Well,
wanted
I-
to think about what you said today and then we'll bring the time next week.
I will look it up. If anyone wants to know about this, yes, please.
I'm not sure if you said it, and I'm sorry if you did. Is this your father's parents or your mother?
This is my mother's mother and father.
And was she very young when this all took place?
Yes, she was 7 when her father was killed, and my aunt was 3, and so of course the repercussions of that were monumental. And in many ways, that's what it wasn't so much that my grandmother was trying to fight back the Nazis. She kept on telling me, but she was trying to protect her children. And that was the most important thing she said. I mean, I wasn't a big hero. I was a mother. I wanted to protect my children. And that motivation led her to function in this incredible capacity as a resistance fighter and as a diplomat and so forth. So, but of course, my mother and aunt suffered consequentially they're still alive today from the loss of their father. More questions, please. Yes?
May I ask why
yeah.
you don't have a French surname?
Because my father's American. I was born Daniel Yves. I have my grandfather's middle name. My son is Marc Yves. My last name is Harris. They were au pair. My mother, but my father was Harris, so I got Harris. Which, of course, in French you don't pronounce the H in French, so it's Harris en français. It sounds. Yes, please.
Do you have a reading list on your website? The French resistance is one of my favorite subjects, and I find there's a dearth of books.
I don't know the website, but it's certainly something that I could add. If you give me your information, I can send you some suggestions.
Sure, that'd be great.
Yeah, please. I mean, there's a lot out there right now. Some of it is in French, though.
That's my problem. I don't
Oh, you don't read French. See, a lot of the new, there's a lot in translation, but a lot of the newer work is only in French. I guess waiting to be translated. Yeah.
I just finished a book called A Thousand Eyes. Have you read that one?
No.
It's very good. Enjoy it.
Good. Yes, Myrna.
I want to put a pitch in for the Danish resistance.
Yes. Yes.
Unlike the French, they trusted each other, so they could be in groups larger than 3. But they had very similar background. I mean, most of what they did was inspired in London by the British as well.
Right. Let me just add a little footnote to Myrna's accurate and wonderful point, and that is that in this devastation that you're being taught about the Holocaust and genocide, there are resistances. There are active resistances. There are documentation of people who fought back. The Jews didn't all go like sheep to slaughter, as many revisionist historians have tried to make it seem, or even some survivors on occasion. Not here, but in other places where I've been. People fought back. They fought back constantly, even though at times most it's impossible to fight back. It's great. I don't want to stop. More questions, more ideas. Let's keep going. No one's tired. Yes, Barbara.
Daniel, you talk about these remarkable people. Were many of them also named after the war righteous because of what they did? I imagine your grandfather would not have been eligible because he was Jewish,
He was
even
Jewish.
though he was in the resistance.
This is something
And
that
it's a kind of interesting.
it's a
thought.
very interesting. Everyone hear that? about righteous Gentiles and so forth, or righteous people after the war. The problem in the United States, that worked out well. France, and I didn't mention this, but I'm glad you brought this up, Barbara, is that in France, and those of you who are French will deal with this, everybody claimed that they were part of the resistance. I mean, 75–80% of France were either complicitous or they were bystanders. And you know about complicity and being a bystander. So, that's absolutely ridiculous. And as a matter of fact, the French still haven't fully acknowledged their role in implementing anti-Semitic measures for the annihilation of European and French Jewry. The presidents haven't. Even at the 60th anniversary of Auschwitz, the French president was awkward in acknowledging it. The French are strange in that they are common with so many other groups who have difficulties in acknowledging the fact that the country of liberté, égalité, fraternité, of Diderot, of Rousseau, of Jean-Paul Sartre, of Albert Camus, of Simone de Beauvoir, the great philosophers of Montaigne, one of the great essayists and philosophers of France, this country also simply allowed this to happen. So everybody in France would be righteous. I mean, basically, you could give, how many millions of people could be called righteous Gentiles after the Second World War? They were all part of the resistance. They all helped. They were all part of the Maquis. So for people for the 20 years after the war to try to extract who were really part of the resistance in the Maquis versus those who told good stories was very, very hard to do. Yes?
There was the fact that for Germans, you were the children of your father. So my father was not Jewish, so we didn't have to wear the star as children, but my mother did.
Uh-huh.
And when we took the train to go from the little suburb where we lived, Paris, she had to travel in the last carriage. We could travel wherever we liked, and we never knew when we reach our destination if the last carriage would be detached and taken away.
It's very interesting. We're getting close to the end of this discussion, but this is an interesting side note that neither my grandmother or grandfather ever wore the yellow star. And they somehow passed. Remember, I was talking a little bit about physiognomy and phrenology, these 19th century kind of sciences where you could assess a person's ethnic identity by their facial features, which of course today we have far gone in dispelling. But they've passed. I mean, I think they were very Jewish-looking people, whatever that might mean, and they somehow passed for most of the war without identified as Jews. So it was really the fact that my grandfather was a resistance fighter. That was all their problems, but not that they were Jews. And no one ever knew that he was Jewish until afterwards. So it's interesting, this business about the yellow star. I mean, I brought that up because that was a great risk. If they had been caught, again, your mother being Jewish, I mean, if they had been caught without the star, they could have been arrested on the spot and deported, maybe even killed or interrogated, what have you. It was a serious crime. Felony to not be Jewish without the yellow star. But my grandmother never wore one, never wanted to wear one.
Do you have any idea how many French Jews, or any number of Jews from anywhere, were able to deny being Jewish, get their other papers, and get away with it? It must have been pretty difficult.
But many did. Remember that.
Do you have any idea how many?
Myrna, are we done?
No,
Yeah.
I wanted to answer the question
Oh.
about Germany. I can't answer it about France.
Yeah.
But when the Allies were victorious over the Germans, there's a book written called The Last Berlin. There were 1,700 Jews who had been sheltered in the city of Berlin, who were liberated at that time, including a family that lived above Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. So those records don't keep statistics of that, but there are books written about various things that I do know about what happened in Berlin.
Yeah, when it comes to the French, there were thousands. Again, it's hard because again, if you were trying to base it upon, and please forgive me everyone for saying this, I shouldn't say it, but the French have large noses. The Jews have large noses. So, I mean, really, how can you, if you're going to tell a Jew because of the size of his nose, all France is Jewish then, right? It was pretty easy, certainly more, it was greater ease for well-versed Jews in France who were French to slip through. The ones who had accents from different parts of Europe, that was much harder. Because if you had an accent, you betrayed yourself. And if you were Parisian and you had a certain dialect and tonality, and you quote unquote look Jewish, you could pass for the most part. And I mentioned that the underground newspapers were deeply instrumental. And again, if you want information, I have a list of all those newspapers. There were the underground circulation. There were journalists, philosophers, poets who wrote for these papers. They sent codes in poems. They sent codes in philosophical tractates, in movies. Les Enfants du Paradis was a great movie made in France in 1942 that is actually symbolically about resistance. They did all kinds of things. So they were forging passports, papers, you name it. They were all very skilled at doing that, and that's why the numbers in France, were less than they were everywhere else.
I just wanted to say, if you were rich or had rich relatives, you could buy certificates of non-appartenance to the Jewish race. And I have one.
Oh, you do? Oh my goodness! How about that? Well, please pass that document on to your children and grandchildren, and I mean, these kind of things is how we preserve history, so that it doesn't get revised out of existence. All right. Any final thought? Yes, please.
Just a background question.
Yes.
Have the French ever resolved the Dreyfus case? I know it's over 100 years ago. Have they ever come to grips with it?
Here's the thing. France now is the third largest country with a Jewish population. The first is Israel, second is the United States, and the third. So they have the third largest population of Jews in the world today. So all the anti-Semitic history of France is of course scrutinized by scholars, but again, the people, I mean, at least my experience of this, is that the people themselves always downplay the anti-Semitic aspects. In the same way today as they would downplay their vision of the Turks that are actually in France today. Myrna, please.
The largest number of immigrants to Israel in the past 2 years have been French. The upswing in anti-Semitism in France has been quite substantial. And people forget about the Dreyfus affair. I think that on some level, the German Jews enjoyed, before Hitler, enjoyed more hospitable relationships with their fellow citizens than did the French. And the Dreyfus affair is part of history. Are there any students here who have ever studied?
Give us a rough year. Only students. Give us a rough year of when the Dreyfus affair took place.
They've never studied.
God, just take a map. Oh, they never studied it? Yeah. 19th century? Yeah. But you're not a student.
Just a quick, what the Franco-Prussian War? As a result of the Franco-Prussian War and the anybody know?
There was an army captain named Alfred Dreyfus who was falsely accused of espionage, and then when he was proven innocent, he was then tried he was tried, if you will, in public opinion for being Jewish, and it began a huge inquiry into Jews, which led to again anti-Semitic newspapers. Émile Zola, the great French writer, wrote out against it in J'accuse. If you ever want to take a look at that, I mean, it kind of sparked a whole generation of anti-Semitic fervor, which led eventually to the Second World War. But he was innocent, but the fact that he was Jewish became the target of people's condemnation of his so-called behavior. Yeah. Okay, well, it has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.